The Unitarian Church in Quincy, Illinois is proud to present a sermon from our minister, the Reverend Dr. Rob Manning, titled, God's Politics, Jim Wallace, and the Rise of the Evangelical Left. Originally presented on Sunday morning, March the 11th, 2007, and recorded live. This sermon is the second in what we hope will be a continuing series of sermons podcast beyond our walls to all of the world.
Let's join together in the affirmation of the church as it's printed in the beginning of the bulletin. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. United in the free quest of high values in religion and life, we covenant with one another to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. The opening words come from the prophet Micah. We're talking a lot about prophets this morning and social justice with the talk on Jim Wallace and the Sojourners movement. From the prophet Micah, what does the Lord require of you but to love justice, to do mercy, and to walk humbly with God? The reading for meditation is from the Hebrew Bible, because in the talk I'm talking about Jim Wallace, and I'm comparing him to the prophet Nathan, and that Jim Wallace's relation to George Bush is like Nathan to King David. And then I thought, well, we're not all biblical scholars like my friend Father Bill, so maybe it would be a good thing for us to go back into the Hebrew Bible and remind ourselves of the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah and Nathan. And of course, King David reputedly he had 1,000 wives and mistresses, but he couldn't keep himself from having 1,001 when he saw how beautiful Bathsheba was. And so he arranged to have Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, the Hittite, at the front of the army and get killed so that David could have his wife. And that's where the story picks up in the Hebrew Bible in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. At that point, the Lord sent Nathan to David. And he came to him and he said, there were 2 men in a certain city. The one was rich and the other was poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little lamb which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger on hearing this story was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, that man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did that terrible thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, you are the man. We're talking about a person named Jim Wallace, who is a left-wing evangelical Christian, and his movement called Sojourners, and their impact upon American politics. I've got a few quotations from Wallace's book, God's Politics, in the talk, but we'll start with this passage, short passage. So this is Jim Wallace in God's Politics. He writes, "The real theological problem in America today is no longer the religious right, but the nationalist religion of the Bush administration, one that confuses the identity of the nation with the church and God's purposes with the mission of the American empire. American foreign policy is more than preemptive, it is theologically presumptuous, not only unilateral, but dangerously messianic, not just arrogant, but rather bordering on the idolatrous and blasphemous. George Bush's personal faith has prompted a profound self-confidence in his mission to fight the axis of evil, his call to be commander-in-chief in the war against terrorism, and his definition of America's responsibility to defend the hopes of all mankind. This is a dangerous mix of bad foreign policy and bad theology." Well, you know, I recently have come back from my year in Romania, and this past semester, one of the things I was doing in Timișoara was I was teaching a course called Religion and Politics in the United States. Now, it was rather difficult for me to teach that course because it was kind of depressing. I had to explain to the Romanian students this kind of grand narrative of the sea change that our country has undergone from the 60s and 70s to where we are today. In the 60s and 70s, most of the prominent religious Christian voices in the country that had political impact and influence were progressive and on the left wing, and they talked about peace, and they talked about limiting nuclear warfare, and they talked about social change, social justice, ending the Vietnam War. You'll know and think of the Berrigan brothers, the Jesuits who were staunchly opposed to the Vietnam War, or Thomas Merton. And of course there's Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, his stance against the Vietnam War very early, and in his last few years his absolute obsession with fighting the war on poverty in the United States. Even when I was growing up, my little Presbyterian church in my little town was discussing whether we should make the church a nuclear-free zone. So, this was the religion, the Christianity of the 60s and the 70s, but somehow a sea change happened, and it started to happen with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. This was the first time that the conservative evangelicals had such an important impact upon American politics. Spurred mostly by their opposition to abortion, conservative evangelicals proved themselves a very powerful and influential force, starting with the overwhelming victory of Reagan over Carter in that election. This is the time when names like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and James Dobson became household names in the American consciousness and became very important political figures with a political impact. And if you think the days of these conservative evangelicals are over, you have to remember that Pat Robertson is on television here in Quincy and lots of other places every day of the week. And that when George Bush, the current resident of the White House, when he chose his Supreme Court justices, he first called Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell to see if they would approve of the choices. So you can't say that the political power of the conservative evangelicals has seen its heyday, especially not with George Bush in the White House. As much as the right-wing evangelicals loved Reagan, they knew with the election of Bush in 2000 that they not only had a president sympathetic to their views, but they literally had one of their own in the White House. Bush did have a conversion experience, a born-again experience, with the aid of that great conservative evangelical Christian, Billy Graham. Many conservative evangelicals seem to really believe not only that George W. is a true and genuine Christian leader, but also that God wanted George W. to be president, and that this was God's way of protecting us on September 11th by providing us in this crucial period of time with God's own man in the White House. Now, Bush has retained his popularity and support with this important part of the electorate, the evangelical right, despite the fact that he has done these sort of unchristian things like start wars. The war in Iraq in particular was condemned even before it started as an unjust war that could never meet the criteria of just war theory. It was condemned by the national organization of every major Christian denomination in the country except the Southern Baptists. And yet the conservative evangelicals have still remained strongly behind Bush. Here's a quote, for example, from Jerry Falwell in the summer before the 2004 election. He said, "It is the responsibility of every political conservative, every pro-life Catholic, every traditional Jew, every Reagan Democrat, and everybody in between to get serious about re-electing President Bush." And Pat Robertson declared on Fox News in 2004, quote, "I think George Bush is going to win this election in a walk. I believe I'm hearing from the Lord on this. It's going to be a blowout election in 2004. The Lord has just blessed President Bush. It doesn't make any difference what he does, good or bad." Now, of course, we know that Pat Robertson was not quite hearing it right from the Lord on that one. Bush did not win in a walk, but he did win, and largely because of the support of the evangelical community. The key state in that election, as was predicted, was Ohio, and Karl Rove's great strategy was to make a big push to register evangelical voters in Ohio. 50,000 additional evangelical voters were registered to vote in Ohio, and that made the key difference in the slim Bush victory in Ohio. And really, so you could say that the evangelical right is largely responsible for putting Bush in the White House and for keeping him there. Well, I said it was a depressing narrative. And honestly, it's depressing for a person like myself who cares very much about Christianity and about versions of Christianity and what types of versions of Christianity we have that are prominent in our own country. But it's not all depressing. And I have wanted for a long time to share with you something that's really interesting and hopeful, and something that's new, and something that's on the rise, and we might even say the resurrection of a very different type of Christianity, and this is the evangelical left. And probably the most prominent figure of the evangelical left is Jim Wallis. And I know some of you have read God's Politics and are interested in Jim Wallis. Now, Jim Wallis and his organization Sojourners are not really new. They date back to the early 70s, and when they were at an evangelical divinity school in Illinois, and then they moved and became a grassroots organization in D.C. What Jim Wallis and the evangelical left are trying to do, if you sum it up, what they're most essentially trying to do is they're trying to change the political agenda of American Christianity. For a long time, the political impact of American Christianity has been dominated by the evangelicals, and they have had two political issues that are more important than anything else to them. They have had the issues of abortion and gay marriage. And the most essential thing that Jim Wallis and the evangelical left are trying to do is they're trying to replace those two issues with two issues that they think are more important and more central to the teachings of Jesus and of Christianity. And the most essential issues for Jim Wallis and the movement of the Sojourners and Evangelical left, the most important issues are not abortion or gay marriage, but the most important issues are peace, poverty, and social justice. So Jim Wallis and the Evangelical left are trying to restore the biblical emphasis on peacemaking, on ending rather than starting wars, on social justice, and on concern for the poor. And they are trying to translate these traditional biblical values into contemporary political issues. They have been trying to have political influence in such issues as the Iraq War, the national budget, global warming, the crisis in Darfur, and the Bush administration's growing confrontation with Iran. Now, maybe you have never heard of Jim Wallis, Sojourners, or the Evangelical left. And certainly they are not as powerful or influential or as well known as Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and James Dobson. But Jim Wallis and the Evangelical left movement he leads, they are starting to get media attention and perhaps even have a political impact. Jim Wallis has been on Meet the Press. He's been on all the Sunday morning talk shows. He's been on The Daily Show, which young people actually watch and get their news from. He's been on The Today Show and several other TV programs seen by millions of people. And his book, God's Politics, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 months. Now, true, that doesn't make it a threat to the Da Vinci Code, but it is an accomplishment. And did you know that in 2003, when many people around the world, and right here in Quincy, were trying to dissuade the Bush administration from going to war against Iraq, that Jim Wallis and several other religious leaders of the evangelical left were actually regularly meeting with members of Tony Blair's administration to get them to talk to Blair and Bush and talk them out of starting the war in the first place. Jim Wallis and other religious leaders actually met with Tony Blair, who is a very Christian person himself. He's a very committed Christian. They met with him for 45 minutes. They argued, and Jim Wallis was the leader of this group of religious leaders who met with him. They argued that a war against Iraq would be illegal, unwise, and immoral. But they did more than just say what they were against. They presented a plan to disarm Iraq without war. They proposed to let the weapons inspectors do their work and then have the UN come in, depose Saddam Hussein, and put him on trial for crimes against humanity, and then have the UN set up democratic elections in Iraq. Secure the weapons, get rid of Saddam Hussein, and no American occupation of the country. Now, at least according to Jim Wallis, Tony Blair actually listened to this plan and was considering it. His foreign secretary, Claire Short, was actually in favor of it and believed it could work. Now, on the other hand, President Bush refused to even meet with this group of religious leaders, and he ordered the bombing of Iraq to start while Claire Short was still trying to convince Tony Blair that it was a good idea that needed a chance. Claire Short, the foreign secretary, you remember, resigned in protest because she thought this war was a wrong idea. And George Bush never met with Jim Wallis and the other religious leaders to discuss their plan, though he did meet with Billy Graham, who is always on hand to pray with an American president whenever the president decides to drop bombs on someone. Wallis writes in God's Politics, imagine what would have happened if we had been able to really stop this war before it got started. It would have been a major victory for democracy. Imagine the empowerment that all the people who spoke and acted for peace would have felt. We would actually have stopped the war before it started. For the first time in memory, people would look back for years to remind each other of the difference we all made before that potential war with Iraq. Citizens would believe that they could actually make a difference. Whether he has been getting sufficient media attention or not, while he has been doing all this, Jim Wallis has been playing the role of Nathan to George Bush's King David. This progressive evangelical theologian has written so critically of Bush that you might think I wrote it myself. He has stated flat out that the theology of this president, supported by so much of conservative Christianity, is bad theology, is idolatrous, is the theology of empire, and is not Christianity. And I'll quote a passage where he plays Nathan to George Bush's King David. He's talking about how Bush often uses Christian language and even quotes hymns. In a State of the Union address, Bush said that the need is great, yet there's power, there's wonder-working power in the goodness and idealism and faith of the American people. Now, any evangelical Christian would recognize that phrase, power, wonder-working power. The evangelical hymn is about the power of Christ in salvation, not the power of the American people, or any country. This is a complete misuse. And the first verse from the same hymn might have been easily recalled in the run-up to the war with Iraq. Would you over evil a victory win? A later verse from the same hymn says, would you be free from your passion and your pride? On the first anniversary of the 2001 terrorist attacks, President Bush said at Ellis Island, this ideal of America is the hope of all mankind. That hope still lights our way, and the light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, that's clearly a Johannine passage about Christ coming into the world. These last two sentences are straight out of John's Gospel and immediately recognizable to Christians. But again, the light shining in the darkness is the Word of God and the light of Christ. It's not America. Even Bush's favorite hymn, A Charge to Keep, speaks of that charge as a God to glorify, not, as Bush says, to do everything we can to keep safe the American homeland. Bush seems to make this mistake over and over again of confusing nation, church, and God. The resulting theology is more American civil religion than it is Christianity. As critical as Wallis is and the evangelical left of Bush for this wonderful war in Iraq and for Bush's bad theology, he is even more critical of Bush when it comes to his economic and tax policies. Wallis writes in his books and in his magazine, Sojourners, he writes this over and over again, that national budgets are moral documents. He's trying to get the country to pay attention to our national budget. He's trying to get the country to think about whether the national budget that reveals our priorities as a country matches up with Christian principles. He's trying to get the country to evaluate budget and tax policies through the eyes of biblical teachings about social justice and peace and mercy to the poor. And this is precisely where this Nathan goes at this King David most fiercely. Tax policies which run up huge budget deficits, which give huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in society and cut funding for social programs, Wallis says, are unbiblical, unjust, and unchristian. So Wallace is really saying to Christian America and to the conservative evangelicals who have had such a big role in putting Bush into the White House and keeping him there, the evangelical left is really saying to the evangelical right and to the rest of us, you know, Bush looks like a Christian president and he sounds like a Christian president, but he really isn't a Christian president, and he actually does the opposite of what a Christian president would do. Here's another passage where Wallace plays the role of the prophet. Let's tell it as the prophets might have. The decision to drop child tax credits for America's poorest families in favor of further tax cuts for the rich is morally offensive. It is blatant disregard for the poor and an outrageous bias toward the rich. In religious terms, the exclusion of any benefits for poor children in a new tax bill should have been named as a political sin. And those politicians who utter the words of religion and faith and yet who supported the exclusion of the poor deserve to be called hypocrites. The White House approves of all of these changes. They engage in moral double talk when it espouses faith-based initiatives and then allows the abandonment of poor families. The Republican House and Senate leaders who made these choices against the poor should be ashamed of themselves. And the President, too, ought to be ashamed for allowing something to happen that is so conspicuously wrong. Well, I think Jim Wallace and the Sojourners movement and the rise of the evangelical left are certainly something that I needed to include in my course in Romania on religion and politics in the United States. And they are an interesting development on the scene of contemporary religion and contemporary politics in our country. Now, as Unitarians, we might be a little bit more skeptical about the theology of the movement, as much as we might respect it. I mean, a book called God's Politics. There's a lot of ways in which Unitarians might come at that and question it. I mean, for example, is there really a God? Is there really a personal God? And if there is a personal God, does this God really have a politics? And how could we know God's politics? Do we know it through the Bible, through the Hebrew and Christian scriptures? And what about other religious traditions? What other types of politics might we derive from other religious traditions? What form of God's politics would we get from Native American religious traditions? What is the Buddha's version of God's politics? These are all good questions that Unitarians might answer and might raise in response to the evangelical left, as much as we respect it. Well, as I have explained before in previous talks, I've been so disappointed with American Christianity in my life that long ago, during the Reagan administration, I pretty much gave it up. And when American Christianity supported the first Persian Gulf War, I pretty much lost respect for it. And I think American real Christianity in this country has largely been displaced by a form of civil religion that gives us a God who's specially blessed America. And the Bible calls that idolatry pretty clearly. But as Unitarians, we should always keep ourselves open to forms of Christianity that we can respect. As Unitarians and seekers of the Spirit, we are spiritually committed to the reality that prophets may rise up and say things that we all need to hear. Closing words come from another biblical prophet, this time Isaiah. Isaiah 2:4, "Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore."
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of God's Politics, Jim Wallis, and the Rise of the Evangelical Left. It was originally recorded live on March the 11th, 2007, at the Unitarian Church in Quincy, Illinois. We invite you to come and be with us this coming Sunday morning. The Unitarian Church is on the northwest corner of the intersection of 16th and Hampshire Streets in Quincy. During winter months, our regular church services begin at 10:45. In the summer, our gatherings are a less formal round table style of discussion. It begins at 9:30. We can be found on the World Wide Web at uuquincy.org. Imagine a church where people with different beliefs worship as one faith.